So in the last section, we successfully set up our hooks form with useReducer and useState. But as we know, that doesn't mean our state is available globally. So in this section, we'll set up our form with useContext. So as we've seen before, let's start off in our app.js file. And let's import our useReducer we set up previously. And then let's use the useReducer hook in the same way we've seen before. And let's call the variable names state_user and dispatch_user. Then we can just pass in our useReducer and our initial state. And since we're going to be using the same actions, let's just copy and paste the code from our hooks form that we set up in the useReducer hook in the last section. And then let's just make the required changes to these two functions. Let's change the name to useContextSubmit. And let's also do dispatch_user. And we also need the event.persist function call. And this is really because context is a little bit strange, and since we're passing data up from a hooks form to the parent component, it doesn't always work perfectly. So you need this event.persist call to make it work without errors. So let's go in our value prop and then create a property to handle these functions. And let's name these properties useContextChange and useContextSubmit. And then let's use state_user, and remember this is coming from the user-defined variable name we declared above that holds the result of our useReducer hook call. And then for our second value, we can also use the state_user keyword and then .userTextSubmit, because remember the useReducer hook contains the entire initial state. So we don't need to use another useReducer hook to access another property of our state in that reducer. And next, as we've seen before, let's just create two new properties to hold the arrow function for each of our dispatch action functions. And since the name is a little long, we can just copy and paste it here. Now let's go back to our hooks form and set up the context. So the very first thing we need to do is import the entire context object from utils/context. And then as we've seen before, we can just supply that context to the useContext hook and save the result in a variable called context. And then the same exact thing we've been doing, let's create another form to use with this useContext hook. And again, just change all the useReducer text to useContext. And one thing I always forget to do, let's change the submit function in our app.js file. So it should be event.target.useContext.value, since this is the ID we're going to set in the input. And remember, when we're passing in the reference to the function, in our onChange and onSubmit events, it's going to be useContextHandleChange and useContextHandleSubmit, which are the property names we set in the value prop in app.js. And following the same pattern as we've been doing so far, let's also display the state to the UI. So under the React useReducer UI display, we can just create another one for useContext. And then to display the UI, we use context.useContextSubmit. Since again, that's the name of the property we set in the value prop. We don't use state_user.userInputText or anything like that. We have to use the property name in the value prop. And finally, we have to pass the event keyword to both of our arrow functions. So this is it. We can now test our app. So let's go to our browser. So yes, if we begin typing, we're getting the expected output on the screen. But to really test it, let's go back to the home component and go back to our hooks form. It should be saved even though we went to a different component. And perfect, it's working. So let's try something else. Let's try to display the state in another component actually. So we'll change the state from this component, but display it in our another one, in our hooks container. So let's go to our hooks container. And under the useEffectValue Turner expression, let's create another Turner expression. And again, we can just do context.user context submit in the same way we did in the form. And we don't have to initialize another context variable since we already have it initialized here. And then if user context submit is true, we can just display that text. And if not, we can just display no user text. So let's save and test our app. So in our hooks form, let's type in some random text and hit submit. Again, if we go to home and then go on the hooks container, yep, there it is. It's working. Our text is displayed that we submitted in the hooks form. So this is it. This is literally how you set up a global state with just React hooks. So by now you should be able to build upon everything you learned in this course and build up very complex apps. For example, authentication systems, in API requests. Everything I've taught you is basically all the building blocks you need to do those complex apps.